we have let too many powers go from Westminster to Brussels. We've passed too much power over, and we should take some of those powers back. I want us to be in Europe, but not run by Europe. And you'll hear big differences between me and the other two parties. I don't want us to join the euro. I want us to keep the pound as our currency. I don't want us to give up the British rebate. I want to make sure that we get value for money for what we put into Europe. I want to cut some of the bureaucracy, some of the rules, some of the regulations that I think drive business so mad. That's the agenda you'd get from a Conservative government in Europe. And to those who say somehow this would be isolation, I say nonsense. President Sarkozy of France, he stands up for France in Europe. Angela Merkel of Germany, she stands up for Germany in Europe. I would do exactly the same for Britain in Europe.
Thank you. Nick Clegg.
I actually worked for the man who was sent by Margaret Thatcher, would you believe it, to bat for Britain in Brussels. And what I learnt when I was there was this. The European Union is not perfect. Of course not. I mean, this is a club that took 15 years to define chocolate in a chocolate directive. Anything that takes 15 years to define chocolate is not a model of democratic and efficiency. But what I also learnt was this, that there are a whole lot of things, whether we like it or not, whatever your views on Europe and the European Union, which we simply can't do on our own. We can't deal with international crime, which touches and affects every single community in this country on our own. We can't deal with climate change on our own. The weather doesn't stop at the cliffs of Dover. We can't regulate these wretched banks that got us into so much trouble in the first place, which now sprawl across countries. I don't think the European Union is perfect. I want it reformed. That's why I want to lead in the European Union. But we're stronger together and we are weaker apart.
Mr. Brown.
You know, there's 3 million reasons why we need to be part of the European Union, and they're called jobs. 3 million jobs depend on our membership of the European Union. Half our trade is with the European Union. 750,000 businesses, I'm sorry it's not your business, raising the question about the building trade, but 750,000 businesses trade with Europe. And the idea that we should again be isolated and on the margins and not in the mainstream of Europe would be a terrible, terrible mistake. Now, I worked with the European leaders through the global financial crisis. I had to persuade them that we had to restructure our banks and they had to restructure their banks. I had to persuade them that they had to work with America in the G20. But when Europe and America works together, we are so much stronger. Stronger to deal with climate change, which is one of my priorities, stronger to deal with the economy, stronger to deal with international crime, stronger to deal with terrorism. Let us never again be an empty chair in Europe. My fear is that David's policy would put us in that position.
Thank you. David Cameron.
Well, I understand why people like Christopher are very frustrated about the European Union and some of the things that have happened. And I think one of the reasons that people are so angry is their politicians at Westminster have given away powers to Brussels without asking us, the people, first. And I think people felt particularly cheated when the European Constitution came forward and we were told we were going to get a referendum, and Gordon Brown and Labour stopped that from happening, and Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats didn't vote with us to get that referendum. We should have had one. People feel cheated by that. And as a result, one of the things I would do if I was your Prime Minister is straight away pass a law through Parliament that says if ever there's a future occasion when laws are being proposed to pass power from Westminster to Brussels, there would be a guarantee of a referendum held in our country. You send us to Parliament to make decisions, to make laws, to discuss the issues, yes. You don't send us there to give away powers that belong to you. There should be a referendum guarantee if ever this happens again.
Thank you. Mr. Clegg.
David Cameron talks about a guarantee. It was the Conservative Party that gave a cast-iron guarantee to have a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, which it promptly dropped. Look, we do need to have a referendum, I think, the next time there's a big transfer of powers to the European Union, but it needs to be on the fundamental issue. Do we stay in or do we go out? You have a right to make that choice in a referendum. I would argue we should stay in, not because it's perfect, but because I think it's in our interests to do so. Let me give you, Christopher, a very concrete example. There was some time ago an operation by European Union police authorities which broke open a paedophile ring. They arrested 100 sex offenders, many of them in this country, and they released over 20 young women from unimaginable abuse and servitude. It was something called Operation Koala. You can Google it and look it up. Guess what? Conservative MEPs, UK Independence Party MEPs, voted against the measures which made that possible. That is putting dogma above the safety of our children. We are safer together, we're weaker apart.
Gordon Brown.
Well, you know, imagine a European Council meeting if David Cameron was in charge 2 months from now. And he'd have to go along, as he said, and say that he wanted to repatriate the social chapter. That's what gives us paid holidays. And he'd have to break up the European Union meeting and say, look, 26 of you are against this. I'm the only one who's standing for this. And what would happen? We're trying to get an economic recovery. That depends on Germany, France and other countries growing as well, taking our exports. We're having to get an agreement on climate change because of what happened at Copenhagen. Again, that would be postponed because we'd be having a big argument, as we did in the past with the Conservative government, about repatriating powers to Britain. We've got other problems we've got to deal with, and these include security and terrorism. These are the issues. Let's look to the future. Let's not have a Britain-only solution, and let's not go back to the days when we were fighting with the rest of Europe in the past.
Gentlemen, over to you now for free debate.
What I would say is what you're hearing from the other two is, frankly, don't trust the people. Don't ask them when you pass powers from Westminster to Brussels. Just give in to everything that comes out of Brussels and don't stand up for your country. No. That, to me, is the same old politics. Let me just ask this important point. This idea that somehow an in-out referendum is what the public wants, I don't think is right. It's a con. What people want when a new treaty comes along, when a constitution comes along, is to have that choice to vote on that constitution.
Let's be clear. What would have been a con would be to have a referendum on one individual treaty, which even if we'd had the referendum and then we'd rejected the treaty, would have allowed, Christopher, the European Union to carry on exactly as before. Let's have the fundamental debate. I worked in my previous life, before going into politics, for a while as a negotiator on behalf of all of us, on behalf of Britain and the European Union, negotiating trade deals with the Chinese government, the Russian government and others. And what I noticed there was that the Chinese and the Russians, they only listened to what we were saying because I was representing the largest single market in the world of 475 million consumers. Now, of course there are daft rules, of course it does daft things, but it seems to me that we punch above our weight when we stand together in Europe, in a world, frankly, where you've got a lot of superpowers bumping up against each other and where, to coin a phrase, size does matter.
You see, David wants a referendum if there's any future change. Nick wants a referendum now on the European Union. I think what people want is us to solve the employment problem, the economic problem, and get on with the job. And I need to work with these other countries in Europe, President Sarkozy, Chancellor Merkel. David's walked away from the European People's Party, which is an alliance of the centre progressive parties in Europe, and gone in with a group of right-wing extremists. I want to work with the sensible people in Europe to get jobs for our British economy. If we don't trade with Europe, we lose jobs, we lose businesses, we lose growth. Let's make sure our priority is trading with Europe, sorting out the problems of the European Union, yes, but let's make sure we get a recovery that's stronger than ever.
You can hear there is a difference. There's a real difference between us. And the reason about this European party is I just think it's the hypocrisy that people are fed up with, of British politicians standing here in Bristol saying, I'm going to stand up for us in Europe and we shouldn't give away all these powers and we should fight for British interests. And then over they go to Brussels and they do exactly the opposite. I want to make sure that we say the same thing when we're in Bristol about wanting to be in Europe but not run by Europe, wanting to have a single market that's good for our country, wanting to trade with Europe, but not go over to Brussels and say something different. It's that, the same old politics. How
on earth does it help anyone in Bristol or anyone else in the country, for that matter, David Cameron, to join together in the European Union with a bunch of nutters, anti-Semites, people who deny climate change exists, homophobes? That doesn't help Britain. Of course we need to change the European Union, but you change clubs of which you are a member by getting stuck in, not standing on the sidelines and complaining about things.
What the Liberal Democrats have actually done.
I think
you know who these two guys remind me? They remind me of my two young boys squabbling at bath time. And they're squabbling about whether to have referendums on the European Union. What we need is jobs and growth and economic recovery. We work with our partners to get that. And the sooner Nick realised also we had to work with America and Europe to get economic growth in the future, the better. I'm afraid David is anti-European. Nick is anti-American, and both of them are out of touch with reality.
It's not a question. It's a question of wanting to get things in Europe for your country and standing up for your country. And one of the things the Liberal Democrats would want to do is actually take away Britain's seat on the United Nations Security Council, and replace it with a European one. And that's one of the things that actually gives us the ability to punch above our weight in the world. It gives us influence in the world. And I think that's a huge
final quick word from, first of all, Gordon Brown, then Nick Clegg.
Well, there is no chance of Britain giving up its seat on the United Nations Security Council. We are stronger. We've just been chairman of the G20 as a result of the efforts we made in the economy. We're leading the negotiations on climate change, and we're leading on nuclear.
Final word, anti-American.
I would simply say, don't let people create scare stories to frighten you into thinking that we can't change Europe. Of course we can change Europe. I, unlike David Cameron and Gordon Brown, have been in there, have sought changes. We can do it if we lead.
We're going to have to move on now.